The invitation that wasn't serious, the letter, came folded neatly, slipped under the thin wooden door of her small apartment. At first, she thought it was a mistake. Someone else's name, someone else's life. But no, it was hers, written in flowing ink, inviting her to the biggest party of the season. It was not just any party. It was one hosted by the city's wealthiest family. A family whose name was spoken with awe. She held the paper in her hand for a long time, staring at the fancy letters. Her dress was old, her shoes worn, her life simple. She worked hard every day to survive. And such places were never for people like her. Still, her heart beat faster as she read the words again, as if they might change what she didn't know. What the letter didn't say was that the invitation had been written with cruel laughter. The rich had sent it as a joke, to see if she would really show up, to mock the way she lived. They didn't think she would dare. They thought she would be too ashamed, too aware of her place, but she was not aware of their secret plan. She only saw an open door, a chance. For nights, she thought about it. Staring at the invitation on her table, she wondered if she should go. Wondered if she could even walk through those golden gates without trembling. Part of her said it was foolish, that she would not belong, that they would see her as less, but another part, a quiet and stubborn part, whispered that she had every right. Why should she not go? Why should she let fear hold her back? The day of the party arrived, and the streets around the mansion lit up with cars and music. She stood in front of her mirror, a cracked piece of glass. Holding the only dress she had, it was plain, simple, not like the shimmering gowns she had seen in magazines. Still, she brushed it carefully, washed it again, and wore it with pride. She tied her hair back neatly, put on her old shoes, and took a deep breath. The walk to the mansion felt longer than ever. Every step echoed with doubt. Every corner brought the thought of turning back. People in shiny cars passed her by, their laughter spilling into the night. She clutched her small bag tighter, her hands shaking, her heart pounding. By the time she reached the gates, her legs felt heavy. But she didn't stop. The mansion rose above her like a castle. Its walls glowed with light, chandeliers shining from inside. The air smelled of roses, wine, and perfumes she had never known. Servants stood at the entrance, taking coats, welcoming guests with polite bows. She stepped forward, holding out her invitation, her voice trembling as she spoke. For a moment, the servant's eyes widened, surprise flickering, but he nodded and let her pass, though whispers followed as soon as she entered. The hall was filled with music, the sound of violins mixing with soft laughter. Gold and silver glittered everywhere. Dresses sparkled, jewels flashed. She walked slowly, her plain dress standing out in the sea of wealth. Eyes turned, whispers spread, some hands covered mouths to hide laughter. A few chuckled openly, pointing, nudging each other. They saw her as the joke, the entertainment of the night. But she didn't know their thoughts, not fully. She only felt the sharp sting of their gazes like needles on her skin. Still, she held her head up, trying not to stumble. She told herself she had as much right to breathe this air as anyone. But deep inside, her stomach twisted. Her heart ached. Every laugh in the room felt heavier. Every glance reminded her she didn't belong. The rich had planned it well. They wanted to see her shrink, to see her run out. Embarrassed and broken, yet she stayed, standing quietly, looking around. She didn't speak, didn't argue, just stood there with a calm face, as if daring the room to see more than her clothes. What she didn't know, what no one expected, was that her silence, her calm, would soon change the room. But for now, she stood at the edge of the glittering hall. She was the outsider, the girl who should not have been there, the guest who was never meant to shine. Walking into another world the moment she stepped deeper into the hall. She felt as if she had crossed into another world. Golden chandeliers hung high above her, spilling light like drops of fire across polished marble floors. The music flowed gently, violins weaving together a sound that seemed too soft and too perfect for reality. Tables glittered with crystal glasses, silver spoons, and plates of food she had never seen before. The guests moved like dancers, their gowns sweeping behind them, their suits fitted sharp and clean. She stood at the edge, unsure if she should move or stay still. Everywhere she looked, the sight was strange, almost dreamlike. But the dream was not kind, for eyes kept turning toward her. Curious, amused, or mocking, some of the young men leaned closer to each other. Whispering into their glasses, some of the women lifted brows, smiles curling thin as they looked her up and down. Her dress was plain, her shoes old, yet she walked forward slowly. She told herself that fear would only feed their laughter, so she moved with careful steps, though her heart beat loudly in her chest. Each step echoed like a secret drum that only she could hear. She made her way toward a corner of the room, hoping to blend with the crowd. But blending was impossible. The glow of wealth around her only made her simplicity clearer. A group of guests near the fountain whispered and laughed, one of them pointing as she passed. She felt the sting, yet kept her head lifted. She would not show them tears. She would not give them that victory. Servants walked by carrying trays of golden drinks. She reached out, hesitated, then drew back her hand. She didn't even know what the drinks were called, didn't know if she should touch them. So she folded her hands in front of her and stood. Still, she looked at the paintings on the walls, the grand staircases, the chandeliers. She let her eyes stay on the beauty instead of the people. But the people noticed, and they began to test her. One of the women stepped close, her gown glittering with stones. Her voice sweet but sharp as she asked where the girl had bought her dress. It was not a question of kindness. It was a test, a trap. Others around her leaned in, waiting for the answer. She felt the heat rise in her cheeks, but she answered quietly. "I made it myself," she said. Her voice soft but steady. The laughter that followed was loud, too loud, echoing across the hall. Yet in that laughter was also a flicker of surprise. For while they laughed at the dress, some could not hide the respect for her courage. She had not lied. She had not tried to pretend. She had spoken simply, and the truth, though mocked, carried its own strength. Still, the games continued. A man asked her if she had ever traveled to another country. He smirked, expecting her silence. But she answered with calm, "No, but one does not need to travel far to see beauty." She replied. Some chuckled, but a few grew quiet, the words touching them in ways they did not expect. She stood there, the target of their attention. And though her heart trembled, her face stayed calm. Every question thrown at her, every laugh aimed her way, she answered gently, without anger, without pride. It was not power she carried, not wealth, not glamour. It was something else, something harder to define, a quiet grace that unsettled the room. Still, she was alone, standing at the edge. Her eyes wandered to the servants, moving silently, ignored by the crowd. She offered them a smile, a simple nod, the kind no one else gave them, and one of the servants, carrying a tray, paused just for a second. In that second, there was something unspoken, a moment of shared humanity. The rich saw it too. Though they didn't understand, why would she smile at a servant? Why would she waste her time on those beneath notice? But she didn't care what they thought. She knew that kindness costs nothing, and respect was worth more than jewels. The music grew louder. The hall filled with brighter laughter. More guests arrived, each dressed in gowns and jewels. Yet in the middle of that glowing world, she stood like a shadow that refused to fade, that refused to break. She was not welcome, but she was present. And her presence alone was enough to disturb their perfect order. By the end of the hour, whispers followed her wherever she walked, not only of laughter, but of curiosity. They mocked her. Yes, but they also watched her. And though she didn't yet know it, their mockery was already turning to something else. Something unexpected. Something that would soon shift the night entirely. For now, she stayed quiet. She sipped water from a glass offered by a servant. She stood near the wall, her eyes steady, her posture calm. She told herself she would not run. No matter how heavy the stairs, she had walked into this world, and she would not leave until she was ready. And though they laughed, though they whispered, a strange feeling began to spread across the room. The joke they had created was slowly slipping out of their control. The mockery begins. The night grew louder as more guests filled the hall. Music floated through the air, laughter rolled like waves, and the tables groaned under the weight of endless food. But even in all that glitter and glow, the eyes of many still turned back to her. She was the shadow among jewels, the plain among the polished, the quiet voice in a room of noise. It didn't take long before the rich decided that silence was not enough. They wanted entertainment. They wanted the joke they had planned to come alive. So one of them stepped forward, his glass of wine in hand, a smirk playing on his lips. He asked her loudly if she had ever worn silk, his voice sharp enough for others to hear. The crowd stilled, waiting, their ears hungry for her answer. She looked at him calmly, her hands folded together. "No," she said softly, "but fabric does not decide a person's worth." For a moment, there was silence. Then a burst of laughter. The man grinned, satisfied, but some in the crowd frowned. Unsettled by the strength in her reply, another guest joined in, a woman draped in diamonds. She asked if the girl even knew how to dance, her tone dripping with false sweetness. Again the hall waited. Again the trap was set. The girl's eyes flickered toward the floor. Then she lifted them slowly. "I have never learned steps like yours," she admitted, "but I know how to move with life." Laughter filled the air once more. But this time it was weaker, thinner, not as certain. The mocking questions kept coming. Had she ever traveled abroad? Did she own jewels? Did she even know what fine wine tasted like? Each question was meant to cut her down, to remind her of her place, and each answer she gave was simple, honest. Unpolished, she didn't fight, didn't shout, didn't lie. Her truth, though plain, carried a weight the rich didn't expect, yet still, they laughed. They laughed to hide the discomfort, to bury the fact that her calm words held more sense than their glittering ones. But the laughter no longer rang as strong. For some of the younger guests, standing near the back, found themselves listening closer. They heard not just a poor girl's answers, but a kind of courage hidden in her voice. The servants too noticed. They moved around the hall, silent as always, but their eyes followed her. They saw the way she stood steady, even as cruel smiles surrounded her, for they knew that look. The look of someone surviving in a world that had already turned its back. And though no words passed, they carried a quiet respect for her in their hearts. The mocking continued. One man even offered her a gold coin, tossing it toward her feet as if she were a beggar. Gasps filled the hall. Some laughed too loud, some turned their faces away. She bent down, picked up the coin, and held it in her hand. For a moment, no one breathed, waiting for her shame, her tears, her anger. But she only looked at the coin, then set it gently on the nearest table. "Gold has value," she said softly, "but it cannot buy dignity." Her voice was not raised, but it cut deeper than any shout, and in that moment, the laughter faltered. Again, still, the night was long, and pride is stubborn. The rich continued their game, refusing to let her win. They asked her to speak about fashion, about travel, about things she had never known. Each time she answered with truth, and each time their trap slipped a little. It was no longer just a joke. It had become a battle of spirit, and though they had wealth and power, she had something else, something quiet but unshaken. Inside her, fear still stirred. Her hands trembled when no one looked. Her chest tightened with every laugh. But she refused to run, refused to leave. She told herself that walking out now would prove them right, so she stayed, even as the questions grew sharper. Even as the laughter tried to crush her, the room itself seemed to change. The chandeliers still glittered, the violins still played. But beneath it all was a tension. Some guests leaned in with curiosity now. Not just mockery, some whispered to each other, not about her dress, but about her strength. And though she didn't know it, she was already shifting the mood of the night by the time another hour passed. The girl had faced more questions than she could count. She had been laughed at, mocked, tested, yet she still stood. Not broken, not begging, not hiding. And that in itself was a quiet victory, for the joke they had planned was no longer just. On her, it was beginning to turn back on them as she stood in the center of their laughter, her calm voice echoing softly in the golden hall. A few among the crowd began to see not just the girl they invited as a joke, but someone different, someone they could not easily define. And though they didn't yet admit it, they wanted to hear more. They wanted to see what she would say next. The night was far from over, and she had already given them more than they expected. A different kind of grace. The night pressed forward. And though the questions had slowed, the eyes had not left her. She still stood among them. Plain yet unbroken, her answers, though simple, had chipped away at their laughter, leaving a silence that felt heavier than noise, but still she remained. At the edge, quiet, almost hidden as the crowd drifted toward games, drinks, and songs. It was there, at that edge, that her grace began to show in ways no one expected as the music swelled. Guests spun in pairs across the polished floor. There, gowns flashing like jewels in motion, servants hurried between them, carrying trays stacked with glasses and plates. Few even glanced their way. For in the eyes of the rich, servants were invisible. But she saw them, she always had, for she knew what it was to be unseen. When a tray slipped from one servant's hands and a glass crashed to the floor, laughter rippled through the hall. Not at the guests, but at the servant who bent low in shame. The poor man's hands shook as he gathered the broken pieces. His face flushed red. The crowd turned away quickly, not caring, only amused. But she stepped forward, kneeling beside him without a word. Her plain dress brushed the marble, her hand steady as she picked up a shard. "Careful," she whispered. Softly. "Don't cut yourself." The servant froze, surprised. For no guest had ever lowered themselves to help him. The sight drew whispers, sharp and hushed. Some of the rich smirked, some scoffed, some raised brows, but the servants who passed nearby noticed. They saw the way her hand steadied his, the way her eyes met his with kindness, and though they said nothing, something shifted in the air. Her act, small as it seemed, carried a weight that even gold could not measure. She rose quietly, brushing her hands, and the music swallowed the moment, but not completely. For a few in the crowd had seen it too, and though their lips did not speak it, their hearts stirred with something they had forgotten. Not pride, not power, but respect. Later, as food was served, she took her place near the end of a long table. The platters were filled with meats, fruits, and desserts shaped like jewels. The guests reached with polished forks. Speaking of fashion and politics, she, with nothing but her hands folded, waited until a servant offered her a plate. She smiled and thanked him, her voice warm. It was such a simple thing. Yet even the servant blinked in surprise. No one thanked him. Not in that hall, not in that world. The guests noticed. Though they tried not to, some leaned closer, whispering as if confused. Why did she treat the servants as equals? Why did she give them the respect the wealthy did not? To them, it seemed foolish, a waste, but deep inside, some felt the sting of guilt. though they buried it under laughter as the evening went on. Her grace showed again and again when a young girl in a heavy gown stumbled near the stairs. It was she who reached out first, steadying her arm. When a servant nearly tripped with a tray, it was her eyes that caught him and gave him courage. To keep moving, her movements were quiet, unnoticed by most, but those who did see could not look away. For her kindness was not loud, not forced, it was natural. And in that natural grace was something that unsettled the proud. Some of the older guests began to study her differently, their eyes no longer mocking, but curious, almost thoughtful. They had come to laugh, to point, to sneer, but instead, they found themselves wondering who she was, what gave her that calmness, that strange power to remain whole among them. The younger ones, those who had been loudest in mockery, grew restless. Their laughter sounded thinner. Their smiles forced. They tried again to draw her into jokes, asking her what kind of jewel she dreamed of. She only answered with a gentle smile. Dreams are not always made of stones. Her words floated like feathers, light, but impossible. To ignore, even those who scoffed felt something stir in their chest. It was not wealth that gave her this grace. It was not knowledge of books, or the polish of etiquette. It was the simple strength of treating others with dignity. A strength they had long forgotten in their glittering halls. By the time another song began, the room no longer felt the same. She was still the outsider, still plain among the polished, but no one could deny the quiet effect she had left behind. The servants moved with lighter steps near her. Some of the guests found themselves glancing her way, drawn without knowing why, and though no crown sat on her head, no diamonds hung on her neck, in that moment, her presence carried something richer. A dignity that could not be bought, a grace that silenced laughter more surely than anger ever. Could the joke that had brought her there was beginning to crack? It was no longer she who seemed out of place, but the crowd itself, so loud, so proud. For she had shown without words that worth is not stitched into gowns or hung in jewels. It is found in the way one treats another. As the night moved forward, the crowd did not yet know it, but the girl they had invited as a shadow would soon become the light of the hall. The turning point the night had reached its brightest moment. The chandeliers blazed like suns. The tables gleamed with untouched desserts, and the music swelled. It was time for the toast. The moment when the host of the evening lifted a glass to command the attention of all. The crowd grew silent. The laughter faded, and every eye turned toward the long table at the center. The host stood tall, his voice carrying across the hall. He spoke of wealth, of success, of the shining name of his family. The guests clapped politely, their faces full of practiced smiles. The toast was meant to close the evening, to seal the night in pride and perfection. But then, with a smirk, the host turned toward her, the girl who stood quietly near the edge of the hall. He lifted his glass toward her and said in a voice sharp with mockery, perhaps our most unusual, "Guest tonight would like to share a word." The crowd gasped, then broke into soft laughter. It was the final trick, the final test, to see her stumble in front of them all. Her heart froze for a moment, her hands trembled, her throat dry. Every whisper in the room pressed against her like a storm. She could have refused, she could have bowed her head and shaken it, but something inside her stirred, a quiet voice that told her this was the moment she was meant to face. She stepped forward, her plain dress brushing the marble floor. Her eyes lifted, her shoulders straightened. She stood before them, smaller than the grand room, but steady. The glass in her hand caught the light as she raised it. Her voice, though soft, carried enough strength to silence the laughter. "I was not born among gold," she began. "I was not raised among silk or jewels." Her words floated gently, yet they struck deeper than the glittering speeches of the wealthy. "I live a life where each day must be earned, where nothing is given without work." She paused, her eyes scanning the room. And though I stand here in a dress that is plain, I carry with me what wealth cannot buy. The crowd shifted, their laughter stilled. Some leaned closer, their ears drawn to her words despite themselves. She continued, her tone calm but filled with quiet fire. I know what it means to hunger, to thirst, to walk with tired feet. I know what it means to dream with nothing but the strength of one's own hands. And I know that kindness is richer than diamonds, dignity stronger than gold. The silence grew heavy. No one laughed now. No one whispered, even. The host's smirk faded as her words flowed like water through the hall. You may have invited me as a joke, she said, her eyes steady, but I thank you. For you have given me this moment. This hall is filled with light, yet I see that true light does not shine from crystal or flame. It shines from how we treat those around us, from respect, from humanity. The glass in her hand trembled. But her voice did not. To those who laugh at the poor, I say, this wealth is fleeting, but character endures. And to those who serve silently, unseen, I raise this glass. For you are the strength behind the beauty. Her words struck like a bell. The servants, still moving in the background, froze, their eyes wide. The guests sat in stunned silence, their jewels and gowns suddenly feeling smaller. It was not anger. She had spoken with not bitterness, but a truth that none of them could deny. When she lowered her glass, the silence held. For a long moment, no one moved, no one clapped. Then slowly, one pair of hands began to applaud, hesitant but real. Others followed, scattered at first, then stronger, until the hall filled with the sound of hands meeting. It was not loud laughter, not mocking claps. It was respect, though they did not fully understand why. The host forced a smile, raising his glass again. But the power of the night had already shifted. What was meant as a final humiliation had turned into something else. The girl they had laughed at now stood taller in their minds than the chandeliers above. She stepped back quietly, returning to her place at the edge of the hall, her heart still racing, her hands still shaking. But she had not broken. She had not stumbled. She had spoken with honesty, and it had been enough. Around her, the whispers returned, but they were no longer the same. Some were confused, some were curious, some even admiring. The servants moved with new energy, carrying trays with their heads higher, for someone had spoken for them, someone had seen them. And though the rich might forget, the servants never would. The night was not yet over, but the balance had shifted. The joke was gone, the laughter weakened. What remained was the echo of her words, words that would linger longer than wine, longer than jewels, longer than pride. And though she stood again in the shadows of the golden hall, she was no longer the shadow in their eyes. She was the voice they had not expected, the spark that had begun to light the night in a different way. Respect gained. The hall had changed, though the chandeliers still burned and the music still played. Something deeper had shifted, invisible but impossible to ignore. The girl who had been mocked, who had been treated as the evening's joke, was now the center of unspoken attention. Her words still echoed in the minds of those who had laughed loudest, and her calm presence unsettled the pride of those who thought they ruled the room. At first, there was silence, the kind that comes after a storm, but then, slowly, the guests began to turn toward her, not with smirks this time, not with cruel amusement, but with curiosity. They leaned closer, whispered to one another, their eyes following her every step. One woman, draped in jewels, approached her with a smile that was not quite steady. She asked how someone like her had learned to speak with such strength. The girl simply lowered her eyes and answered softly, "When you have nothing else, words are all you own. So you learn to guard them carefully." The woman blinked, speechless. Unsure whether to nod or retreat, she moved away quietly, leaving behind a silence that was heavier than her jewels, A man followed, one who had laughed the loudest earlier. He tried to cover his unease with a smile, asking if she had practiced her speech in secret. She shook her head gently. "No," she said. "Truth does not need practice." The words were simple, yet they struck sharper than any blade. He laughed nervously, stepped back, and found himself unable to meet her eyes. Others approached. In twos and threes, their questions softer, their voices no longer mocking. They asked about her life, her work, her struggles. Some asked because they wanted to know. Others because they could not bear the silence between them. But each answer she gave was honest, never bitter, never boastful. She spoke of hardship as if it were a teacher, not a curse, and the guests listened, really listened, in a way they had not done all night. The servants noticed the change first. They had seen many nights in the mansion, many parties filled with laughter and pride, but never before had they seen the rich quieted by someone so plain. They moved around her with respect, offering her food, water, even small nods of gratitude. For they knew, in her words, she had raised them too. She had spoken for them in a hall where they had no voice. As the evening deepened, the laughter returned, but it was not the same. It was softer, gentler, without the sharp edges of cruelty. The guests still smiled, still clinked their glasses, but they also glanced her way. The girl who had walked in as a shadow now stood in their minds like a flame. Quiet, steady, but undeniable. One guest even asked her to join a conversation at the center table. It was a place of honor, one never meant for her. She hesitated, her hands trembling, but she walked forward. Her plain dress brushed against the gowns of silk and velvet. Yet no one laughed this time. No one pointed. Instead, they made space. Moving aside as if the chair had always been waiting for her, she sat carefully, her posture straight, her eyes calm. They asked her about her dreams, expecting perhaps something small. But she spoke of a world where people could live with dignity, no matter how much money they had. She spoke of respect for the ones who worked quietly in the shadows. Her words carried no anger, only truth, and the more she spoke, the more the rich found themselves listening, even nodding, for the first time. They were not the ones teaching, not the ones commanding the room. They were the ones learning, the ones receiving. It was strange, unsettling, but also magnetic. She had no crown, no jewels, yet her presence held them tighter than gold ever could. As the night drew further on, she felt the weight of their attention. She had walked in afraid, expecting nothing but humiliation, yet here she was, seated among them. Her voice respected, her presence sought after. And though she knew their curiosity might fade with the dawn, for this moment, she had shown them a truth they could not escape. At the far end of the hall, the host watched with narrowed eyes. The joke he had planned had turned into something else. The girl had not been broken. She had not been embarrassed. Instead, she had risen higher than the very guests he had sought to impress. He forced a smile, but his glass shook in his hand, for he knew the night no longer belonged to him. It belonged to her, the girl they had invited as a mockery. The girl who had left them wanting more with every word she spoke. And though the hour grew late, though the night was slipping into silence, her presence still filled the hall like a quiet song. One that none of them could forget, no matter how hard they tried. Leaving the mansion, the night had grown old. Though the lights inside the mansion still burned as brightly as the first hour. The music softened, the laughter dimmed, and the guests grew weary, their smiles fading into quiet murmurs. Yet one thing had not faded. The attention fixed on the girl who had walked in wearing a plain dress. She had not sung, she had not danced. She had not worn silk or diamonds. Still, her presence lingered like a warmth in the air. As she sat quietly at the long table, the wealthy leaned closer. They asked her small questions. Not to mock now, but to know what she thought of the world, how she lived each day. What gave her such calmness? Her answers remained simple, her voice soft. But it was that very simplicity that drew them in. They had heard speeches before, polished words full of pride, but never truth so clear. Never dignity spoken with such ease. The servants moved with lighter steps, their eyes resting on her whenever they passed. They knew the night was nearly over, yet they carried trays with renewed energy. For someone had seen them, someone had raised a glass in their honor, and though no jewel could ever buy that moment, it was enough to be remembered. Finally, the music stopped. The last song faded into silence. The host, still wearing his forced smile, lifted his glass one final time. He thanked the guests, spoke of the success of the evening, but his words sounded hollow, drifting like smoke through the air. For everyone knew the true memory of the night would not be his toast. It would be hers, the words of the girl he had invited as a joke. The guests began to rise, their gowns and coats sweeping across the floor. They moved toward the grand doors, their voices hushed as if carrying a secret, yet many of them did not hurry to leave, their eyes still following her. It was as if they feared the night would end too soon, as if they wanted more. She stood slowly, her plain dress still neat, her posture calm, her heart beat fast. For she knew the night was closing. She had survived it. More than survived, she had turned it into something else. Yet all she wanted now was the cool air outside, away from the heavy eyes of the hall. She walked toward the doors, her steps steady, and as she moved, a few guests followed, not to laugh, not to mock, but simply because they did not want her to leave unnoticed. They asked her small things. Will you return? Will you speak again? Their voices were uncertain, almost shy. Like children asking for guidance, she answered only with a gentle smile. Her eyes kind, she had no promises to give, no grand words to leave behind. Her silence was enough, her calm more powerful than any speech at the doors. The servants stood in a line, opening the way. But unlike other nights, their heads were not bowed low. They stood tall, their eyes bright, for she had given them a gift no coin could match. One by one, they nodded to her as she passed. A silent respect, a quiet farewell. The guests watched, and in their hearts, a strange unease grew. For in that moment, it seemed the servants held more dignity than they themselves, and the reason was clear: it was because of her. The girl they had mocked had left behind something they could not buy. She stepped out into the night, the air cool against her face. The stars above seemed brighter, the world larger, freer. Her feet ached. Her dress was still plain, but her spirit was light. She had walked through their world and had not been broken. She had given them words, given them truth, and they had no choice but to hear. Behind her, the murmurs of the guests spilled into the night. Some spoke of her with awe, some with confusion. A few still tried to laugh, but their laughter rang empty. For deep down, even they knew the joke had turned. She had not been the one mocked. They had, as the carriages rolled away, as the lights of the mansion dimmed into distance. She walked alone down the quiet street, her shoes worn, her bag light, but her steps steady. And though she had nothing in her hands, she carried with her something rare. She had left a mark on a world that thought itself untouchable. For the rich would wake tomorrow to their jewels, their gowns, their endless wealth. But they would remember her, the girl who spoke of dignity and kindness, the girl who walked into their hall as a joke and left as the only truth worth keeping. And as she disappeared into the night, her head lifted high. Those who had followed to the doors still stood there, silent, unmoving, as if afraid that by stepping away they might lose the moment. They had laughed at her once, but now they wanted more. And though she had given them nothing but her quiet grace, it was enough to leave them wanting. The lasting lesson: the mansion grew quiet after she left. The lights still burned. The glasses still sparkled, but the energy of the night was gone. The laughter had faded, replaced by something heavier, something that lingered in the air long. After her steps had vanished, the guests who had once mocked her now sat silently. Their minds restless, their hearts uneasy. Some tried to pretend nothing had happened. They raised their glasses, forced out empty words, but it was no use. Her voice still echoed in their ears, soft yet unshakable. Her plain dress and steady eyes had left a mark deeper than silk or gold ever could. The servants, as they cleared the tables, exchanged quiet glances. They spoke no words. But in their hearts, they carried pride. For once, someone had seen them. Someone had spoken of their worth. It was not the wealthy who lifted them that night, but the girl who had nothing, and that truth would stay with them longer than the taste of any wine in the days that followed. Whispers spread beyond the mansion walls. The city spoke of the party, but not of the food. Not of the music, not of the host. They spoke of her. The girl who had been invited as a joke. The one who had stood in a plain dress and silenced a hall full of pride. Some called it strange, others called it bold. But those who had been there knew it was more than that. It was honesty, dignity, a reminder of something they had forgotten, that worth is not stitched into clothes, not poured into crystal, not hung around the neck. It is carried in how one walks, how one speaks, how one treats others. The wealthy who had laughed found themselves thinking of her when the nights grew quiet. They remembered her words when they looked at their jewels, when they dined in their halls, and though many tried to push the memory away, they could not. For the image of her standing calm and steady refused to fade. The host himself, proud as he was, could not shake the feeling he had wanted to humiliate her, to turn her into an evening's entertainment, but instead she had turned his hall into her stage. And though he would never admit it aloud, deep inside, he knew he had been defeated. Not by wealth, not by power, but by truth spoken in a voice softer than his pride. The girl returned to her life, to her small apartment, to her daily struggles. Her dress was still plain, her shoes still worn, her bag still light. But she carried something now that even the richest could not buy. The knowledge that she had faced their laughter and left standing taller than before. Neighbors who had once overlooked her began to see her differently. They heard of the night, the words she had spoken, and their eyes shone with quiet admiration. She did not boast. She did not retell it with pride. She lived as she always had, simple, steady, kind. But the story spread, carried by whispers, carried by those who could not forget. For the rich, the lesson was harder. They had built their lives on walls of gold, on towers of pride. But for one night, a girl without wealth had shown them what true richness was. And though they dressed again in silks, though they laughed in their halls, a seed had been planted. One they could not uproot. Some of them, in quiet moments, began to treat their servants with a little more respect. Some offered thanks, some looked into the eyes they had once ignored. Not all changed, not all learned, but the shift had begun, and it had started with her. The girl they thought too small to matter, years later, when people spoke of the great parties in the mansion. Most were forgotten, their glitter lost to time. But not that night, never that night. For that was the night when a plain girl had walked into gold and left behind something brighter than light. She had given them more than words, more than a speech. She had given them a mirror, showing them what they were and what they lacked. And though they tried to laugh it away, the reflection remained, a reminder that pride fades, but dignity lasts. And so her story was told and retold, not in books, not in speeches, but in whispers and memories. The girl invited as a joke, who left them wanting more. The girl who proved that greatness is not measured by riches, but by the quiet strength of a heart that refuses to break.